Thank you very much, Nikki, and it's always a pleasure to be back at APORDE course. Of course, I would very much prefer to be there physically in South Africa, but it's what it is. We have to adapt, and we're all used to online methods now. I've been teaching online since pretty much the end of the previous academic season at SOAS, and it works well. But we do miss the human face-to-face contact. Let me just share my screen just to go further in terms of the overview of the session today, and I'll try to cover all the slides as much as possible, but I do want to leave some time at the end for questions and for debate, because I know that many of the issues that will be discussed today are controversial, contested, and they require a lot of debate. And as you will see from the presentation, there are plenty of uncertainties with regards to conceptualization and measurement, especially of poverty on a global scale and a national level. So I'm going to try to cover three broad issues and themes primarily. One is looking at the rise of poverty studies and looking at poverty in history. And by doing that, we will try to look at what we know about the long-term trends, what are the main stylized facts. And as you will see, the sort of broad stylized fact is that poverty has declined worldwide, at least with regards to existing widely accepted statistics, but I'll get to this during the lecture, of course, but with contradictory and some uncertain tendencies. So there is one camp in the debate that tends to argue that, by and large, during the process of capitalist development and the globalization of capitalist development, overall living standards in absolute terms have improved on a global scale, and that is reflected in the poverty statistics that we have. Now, we will then move on to the question of conceptualization of poverty, and particularly the measurement, given that measurement is very important for any diagnostics, i.e. to really know the nature and the extent of poverty in any particular context, how it is evolving over time, and whether that nature is also changing over time. And perhaps one of the main messages is that how poverty is thought about, and I will contrast two different approaches, how it is defined and measured constantly changes, particularly in relation to the measurements. There are endless debates about the best indicators and the most accurate picture that we can take statistically, both on a global scale and at national level. And then the third theme is really what drives poverty reduction, and what are the kinds of strategies that have been put forward, especially since the issue of poverty has become so dominant in international policy debate, pretty much from the 1990s onwards. I will provide a critical view of the dominant mainstream vision of poverty reduction as not being particularly effective, and not really learning from historical lessons. So these are the three broad themes, three issues that I'd like to cover. So let's start with the history. And as I said before, really, this dominant poverty studies, or this literature on poverty, is actually quite recent. We're talking, the last 30, 40 years, where we've had really pretty much endless debates about the concept and the measurement of poverty and what has happened over time, whether there has been poverty reduction or not, and to what extent. But of course, there was some interest and attention to questions of poverty much earlier on in the context of Europe, certainly the work of Campaign and Condorcet around the 18th and towards the 19th century. There was really the first time that poverty was not seen as a matter of natural law, and it was seen as a policy issue, i.e. that everyone could be protected versus insecurity in the context of republic in France particularly. From there, you start seeing a contrast between looking at poverty reduction as a matter of charity, let's help the poor, versus looking at poverty in terms of social insurance, in terms of a social general commitment where the state has a role to play. So in a way, this has been coming from quite a long time, but it has only been in the 20th century where core policy strategies and state intervention became more or less dominant in relation to addressing questions of poverty. In the context of England, in the late 19th century, evidence also became a significant issue. For the first time, really, poverty was seen as something that required some measurement and that requires some kind of understanding of its extent and its evolution over time. It is true that in the Victorian era, most of the time, and both within government, but more broadly in society, it was seen as a matter of personal morality, where the government really didn't have a significant role. But it was the work of two wealthy businessmen in England that led to the beginning of statistical surveys that began to look at the distribution of poverty geographically. And they started with London, and this is Charles Booth and Rowntree. And they published this really interesting book, that actually I've got a replica in my house. And it was basically maps of London where you could see different degrees of poverty reflected in different colors. And it's interesting how the geography of, at that time was one of the biggest cities in the world, London, was really characterized by quite deep pockets of poverty in particular areas. And the geographical distribution was interesting. It wasn't just pockets in one side of the city, but pockets which were more or less distributed across different parts of the city. But what is interesting about this is that this was really quite a major effort in collecting data, collecting information from households in different parts of the city to really ascertain the welfare of these people and to really ascertain the gaps that existed between people in certain streets and certain areas of the city and people living almost across the road. So in a sense, it wasn't just about poverty, it was also a map that reflected the sheer levels of inequality that already existed in Victorian England, was going in London at that time. So this is one of these early efforts. Now, fast forward to the current era, we have quite a wealth of evidence and information about poverty trends. For the first time, we are able to draw graphs like the one that you see on the screen, where we see the evolution of the poverty rates. This is the proportion of people living under a poverty threshold, what we call the poverty line. I'm going to go back to this question of the poverty line later on when we discuss measurements. So this is the first time that we are able to construct these graphs that, by and large, show what I said at the beginning of the session. There has been quite a substantial reduction in the poverty rates. So, for example, according to these statistics, we would be able to say that in 1820, 80% of the world population, for which there were statistics available, lived as 20% do today. So that obviously reflects quite a substantial reduction in poverty. The following graph, and this is one of the most widely used sources of statistical information on a wide range of indicators, our world in data, which I strongly recommend. It's available online. You can play with the graphs, you can play with the data. And here we see the share of the world population living in absolute poverty. Again, this is in relation to the, what we call the World Bank poverty line. Again, I will come back to this later on. You can see there that we have different potential measures. We have the famous $1 a day, then we have the $2 a day, and the one that was used up to 2015, the $1.90 a day. And regardless of the particular poverty threshold that we use, most of these graphs basically tend to show quite a dramatic reduction in poverty, particularly in the last 40, 50 years. So when you compare, for example, the darker line here with the other lines, you see that the speed of poverty reduction has actually, according to this data again, accelerated over time. And the starting point, 1820, is a starting point where pretty much the vast majority of the population were living below that World Bank poverty threshold. Now, we can see this also in relation to changes in the global income distribution. This is also an interesting way of looking at how geographically the concentration of poverty has changed over time. So here we compare three different time points, 1800, 1975, and 2015. And you see this is a distribution function for daily consumption per capita. So obviously, daily consumption per capita on average has been moving upwards, has been increasing on a global scale, but with differences, quite substantial differences across regions. So you see, particularly the big change between 1800 and 1975, you see in yellow, Europe, pushing forward quite rapidly, and therefore, where the vast majority of people would be even above that international poverty line, the World Bank poverty line, as we call it. And the other big dramatic change that you see there is Asia and Pacific, which is primarily driven by China. And you can see this by comparing the 1975 with the 2015. And within this graph, you see where Africa is, and this would include North Africa as well, North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. And we do see two things. A, that there has been improvement, but actually it has been much slower. And two, that nowadays, 2015, Africa contains a much larger proportion of people living below the poverty line compared to the previous periods, according again to these statistics. So you can see how global inequality has been changing, the huge impact that growth and structural change has had on global income distribution statistics when you look at Asia, and particularly China, and how other regions of the world have performed comparatively during this period of time. And an important issue to bear in mind is that it is perfectly possible to see this substantial reduction in the proportion of people living below these absolute poverty thresholds, while global inequality increases. So another way of looking at an indicator of inequalities by looking at the labor income shares in developing and emerging economies. And as we can see here, these labor income shares have been going down quite substantially, especially from the late 70s onwards, then a slight improvement in the early 1990s, but again going down towards the 2000s. And again, this is to an extent also driven by what's happening in China, where, as you know, the living standards have substantially improved in absolute terms, but inequality levels have substantially increased. So it is perfectly possible to have these two phenomena at the same time, both globally and at national level, where you see significant reductions in the levels of absolute poverty, as it is defined according to this World Bank International Poverty Line, and significant increases in inequality. And this is particularly true in countries that have undergone substantial, quite rapid processes of economic development, economic growth during this period. Now let's move to the question of concepts, and let's see whether we can make sense of these statistics by first having a critical glance at different ways of approaching and conceptualizing poverty. And here I'm just going to highlight two broad contrasting approaches. And I highlight these two because they do encapsulate some of the big debates that we still have today about the nature of poverty and what has happened to poverty historically and more recently. So the first approach is what we could call the residual approach, whereby the poor, i.e. those who live below these poverty thresholds, tend to be seen are those left behind by the processes of economic growth, for example, left behind by globalization. Here, poverty is seen as the have-nots, as being without things, being without access to things. So that's why we call it this residual approach. Obviously, the implication of this approach is that in order to reduce poverty, what you need is to incorporate these people into these various processes of growth, of globalization, etc., etc. Is being able to give these people what they don't have, what they're lacking. So there is, again, a lot of emphasis on the lack of. And very often it is the lack of assets, for example, the lack of access to education, the lack of access to X, Y, and Z. And this is pretty much when you read, standard conventional profiles for a country, this is very much how the narrative tends to work. The poor in this country have all these different forms of deprivation. They lack all these different things. So what we need is to give them access to all these different things. And then we move on to the next set of arguments, which is, in order to get access to all these kinds of things, you need growth. Okay. So very often the residual approach has been associated with a fairly trivial trickle-down economics type of approach, where the assumption is that as long as you achieve substantial, fast and sustained economic growth, then you will be able to reduce poverty. I'll come back to this point later on. Now, the contrast with this is what we call the relational approach, whereby poverty is not seen simply as a lack of access to, etc., is seen as the outcome of relations. And when we talk about relations, and this is within a broader political economy approach to development, we're talking about social relations of production, social relations of exchange, i.e. how markets actually work in reality, and the associated power relations. So all social relations of production, exchange, etc., are linked to well-established and sometimes shifting power relations between different groups in society, between the state and society, and so on and so forth. Therefore, these social relations of production, exchange, and the associated power relations generate what we call social relations of inequality. So here we're looking at different manifestations of inequality by class, gender, ethnicity, nation, caste, in some contexts, etc., etc. And this approach allows us to look at poverty from the perspective of these social relations of inequality, i.e., for example, whether particular groups of people are far more affected by structural poverty, i.e. poverty from which it's very hard to escape, whether women are particularly disadvantaged with regards to a range of issues of access and other things, and employment and so on, and the same for other forms of inequality. So again, the relational approach tries to really bring poverty and inequality together into the same picture. Now, in the second approach, in the relational approach, it's very important to look at poverty in relation to the notion of exploitation, and particularly the notion of exploitation within a Marxist political economy approach. And here I'm going to highlight different ways of understanding, different manifestations of what we call exploitation. First of all is the idea of not being exploited enough. Famously, Robinson said, 1962, that the misery of being exploited by capitalists is nothing compared to the misery of not being exploited at all. The idea that actually capitalist development comes with contradictory outcomes, that by being exploited, actually living standards of working classes can improve despite the sheer levels of inequality compared to a situation where you don't have dynamic capitalist development. So again, this is something that I throw there just for reflection, but also think about the hyper-exploitation that happens between people, in particular in the poorest and less dynamic segments of the economy. For example, think about urban informal labor and those activities characterized by very low levels of productivity, very low levels of remuneration, where you have a dynamic of exploitation that happens among the poor, which is perhaps more extreme than the exploitation that happens when people are employed by big transnational corporations. You may also want to think about self-exploitation as a phenomenon among individuals and households, which try to achieve a minimum level of survival, where coping strategies are driven by distress, and therefore these people end up exploiting themselves. The reason I say this is because actually a lot of the mainstream narrative of poverty reduction seems to be suggesting that precisely this is what you need. People need to exploit themselves more in order to escape poverty. So in a sense, the celebration of self-employment as a way out of poverty is a form of responsabilization of the poor when it comes to poverty reduction. We'll come back to this in the third part of the session. And then let's not forget about the exploitation that happens within households, particularly important in the context of rural economies, where you see the labor of particular members of the household, women, youth, being exploited. And that requires an understanding of intra-household power relations and conflict. That is important also to understand poverty dynamics and the nature of poverty in different contexts. This is indeed important when we try to compare not just the levels of poverty, whether people are poor or not poor according to some notional threshold, but also the nature of poverty. Poverty in an urban slum is not the same as poverty in a remote rural area. People live poverty in different ways, and that also has to do with these intra-household dynamics, which lead to different levels and forms of exploitation within the household. But the point is that within all these, you see that exploitation is central to the discussion, that the relationship between these different forms of exploitation and poverty needs to be tackled, needs to be addressed and understood. Understanding power, poverty, and power is essential in a relational approach. As I said before, in this approach, poverty is not just simply residual, but is intimately linked to the basic logics of capitalist accumulation. And capitalist accumulation comes with contradictory outcomes and tendencies. We see all the time unequal opportunities, the spiral of debt, how people get in debt, dependence within the household, between households, between groups of people and the state, the contradictory effects of large-scale interventions, etc., etc. We also see that poverty in particular societies may be driven by what we call categorical exclusion, i.e. certain categories of people, because of their race, the caste, etc., are systematically discriminated against, and that puts them in a difficult position when it comes to escaping poverty. So these different forms of categorical exclusion are very often determined by the direct exercise of power by others, and these could be through formal or informal means, and it could happen by power as agenda setting, i.e. how the dominant agenda in a given country or perhaps globally determines what categories of people benefit from this or that process, from growth, from globalization, from state interventions, etc. So the creation and maintenance, this is historically very important, the creation and maintenance of categories of exclusion in different societies has been a very important marker of different kinds of poverty and the evolution of poverty in these different contexts. But all requires an understanding of the contradictions that are inherent to the processes of capitalist development, which is, what we have in our societies. So power can be exercised, and power can have different implications for poverty, for better or for worse. For example, you take a highway bridge in New York City, creates huge numbers of jobs, but also ruthlessly displaces thousands of people and destroys communities. And what is the effect? What are the effects of this? And to what extent people fall into poverty situation because of such an intervention? Or think about land concessions, large land concessions in Ethiopia or in other countries, which may lead also to many jobs, may lead to foreign exchange, which is also very important for the process of development, as you've probably seen in other sessions of the course. It may also lead to dynamic sector linkages, which create other jobs in other sectors. But of course, it may also displace people, pushing them into a more precarious status, perhaps into poverty. The gains of some, maybe at the expense of others, and at the end of the day, we always try to see to what extent a particular intervention has a far more positive net effect than a competing intervention with regards to levels of poverty. So enough for the concept. Let's now look at measuring poverty. So as you can see from what I've discussed so far, there is no clear consensus on what poverty means, although, as many of you probably know, the World Bank tried to establish this consensus, tried to come up with a definition of poverty that was sufficiently encompassing to include a significant number of different dimensions rather than just one particular dimension. But perhaps the biggest debates that we have and the biggest controversies focus on questions of measurement and how we can establish whether poverty has declined or has increased in particular context or on a global scale. And perhaps it is in relation to the global scale that we have more of these debates. So what we think we know about poverty today is indeed clouded by misleading measures. We have a number of different indicators, potential indicators, some which clearly dominate in mainstream discourses, but they may be misleading because they don't really capture all the things that we need to know in order to assess whether poverty is indeed increasing, declining or not, or what. Unreliable data for every measure, that is a very important question. Do we have significant measurement errors? And if those measurement errors are substantial, how can we rely on these widely used measures? And then ideology, masquerading as common sense. This is very common, very typical in the production of the so-called poverty profiles, where for a given country, we show what are the key characteristics of the poor, and therefore what are the kinds of things that we need to do in order to reduce their poverty status. And as Angus Deaton is a Nobel Prize economist, actually one of the economists who contributed most to these questions of measurement and understanding welfare, household welfare. Angus Deaton, after many years of working on this and seeing how the World Bank has come to dominate this enterprise of measuring poverty, concluded not long ago that poverty measurement is clouded in a fog of technicalities that are sometimes really difficult to follow. This is also why I wanted to show this very remarkable and controversial paper by the very famous historian Allen, who has questioned the World Bank poverty line and the sort of conclusions that have been reached based on the World Poverty Line, comparing it to what he calls the basic needs poverty line, which he tries to use in order to look at what has happened to poverty levels going back quite far to the Middle Ages in relation to Europe, and also with references to India as a contrast. And there you see, when Allen talks about different ways of calculating poverty line, he tries to infer the basket of goods that are relevant for different periods of history in different contexts. You see the number of technicalities there and how easy one can get lost in all this cloud of assumptions, of interpolations and implications, which basically leads us to think that, well, what we know about poverty in statistical terms is actually probably much less than what we think we know, or at least what some people think they know. Now, the way poverty is measured today clearly reflects a preference for monetary poverty lines. The reason I stress this is because actually the World Bank itself, as an institution that has taken a leading role in conceptualization and the measurement of poverty, the World Bank itself has always said that poverty is multidimensional, that there's no one way of looking at poverty, precisely because its nature is complex and very context specific. So on the one hand, the World Bank says this, and on the other hand, they say, well, the best measure to capture the extent of poverty, i.e. how many people live in a poverty situation, is by using monetary poverty lines that are based on our estimates of consumption per capita, and therefore household consumption, and then translated into consumption per capita. So that led to the World Bank Poverty Manual, basically saying that the poor are those whose expenditure, consumption, and I say expenditure because very rarely income is used for these estimates. It is the expenditure per capita that falls below a poverty line, and the poverty line is something that is defined according to some basic norms of consumption. What is the subsistence level? That's how other people would call it, the subsistence level in a particular society. The big challenge, however, is that the World Bank tried to do this for the global scale. It wasn't just one thing is trying to estimate, how many people live below a certain poverty threshold in a given country, where you can collect information about consumption standards and consumption patterns in that country, and then try to get a fairly realistic poverty line within that context. A completely different story is to try to do that for the whole world. Can we have one threshold that is usable for countries at very, very different levels of economic development, where the nature of poverty is also quite different? Think about the nature of poverty in the United States or in Europe, and the nature of poverty in Southeast Asia, in Latin America, or in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa. So the big question really is, how do we construct these poverty lines, these thresholds, on the basis of which we estimate how many people are poor? And the main starting point, and this is why the World Bank was able to an extent to come up with its estimates, is the household surveys, and particularly the household surveys that included very detailed questions on household budgets, on consumption, household consumption. And by and large, this process really started in the 1980s. This is really when the World Bank invested substantial amounts of money, particularly late 1980s, and then it became far more widespread in the 1990s and onwards. Household surveys that were supposed to be nationally representative, therefore statistically representative of the situation of the population in every country. And many of these household surveys and these efforts were focused on poorer countries, on low-income countries. Therefore, countries in sub-Saharan Africa were quite a significant part of this story. There was primarily on the basis of these household surveys where consumption expenditure was calculated that the World Bank researchers were able to calculate these global poverty lines. Now, for a poverty line, conceptually, what you need is to agree on a minimum standard. The poverty line is going to be the cost of achieving a given level of welfare defined by that minimum standard. And this is again where we will start having this debate. But the minimum standard is very often driven by a nutritional standard. So we say that, and that's why some people often talk about poverty lines as starvation lines. You know, it's really trying to get to the bottom of the subsistence level. And for that, we need to agree on a calorie intake standard, plus some basic non-food items that are absolutely necessary to survive. You know, you could think about shelter, accommodation, fuel, clothing. And then we set the line accordingly. Obviously, these nominal poverty lines can change over time because they also reflect rising incomes. So as incomes rise, then those standards, those minimum standards may also change. And therefore, you may come up with different lines, different levels when you compare different countries. And the third challenge is trying to fix the line over time. So how you adjust for inflation, for changes, not just in the overall level of prices, but also in relative prices. You know, how different goods and services have different price trends compared to others. And therefore, that can also substantially affect your basket, your consumption basket. So as you can imagine, this is not an easy task, and very often economists have really struggled to explain how these lines are estimated. And then we convert these. This is what we do for the national poverty lines. You know, every country would have a national poverty line, and we will estimate poverty on the basis of that. But then, how do we then calculate a global international poverty line? So what we do is we take the poverty lines, you know, all the basic needs costs, averaging for the poorest sample of countries. We use our purchasing power parity estimates, i.e. these exchange rates that are not market exchange rates, that try to capture the differences in prices for similar, at least comparable goods and services. This is again another big challenge because we can't always find sufficiently comparable goods and services. You know, imagine you compare a haircut in Mozambique with a haircut in the United States. Again, it is supposed to be the same service, but the prices will be completely different for all sorts of reasons, not just because of the different levels of welfare in these countries. But what we know from the World Bank International Poverty Line, again, this is one point that Alan makes in his paper, is that this is primarily an African poverty line, i.e. a global poverty line that is driven primarily by the national poverty lines of a sample of African countries, and that it is applied on a global scale. By basically, the assumption is that, well, this is really the bottom subsistence level on a global scale, so other countries are likely to be much better compared to that, and therefore that would explain why the poverty levels in other regions of the world are somewhat lower than what we observe in sub-Saharan Africa. So in a sense, Alan's point is almost this happens by design rather than reflecting an effective reality. And now we use the 2011 prices for the famous 1.90 poverty line to update that international line. So every time we have a new estimate of differences in prices across countries, then we re-estimate our purchasing power parity exchange rates, and when we get a new poverty line. So this is pretty much what the World Bank has been doing over the years, from the first $1 a day poverty line until the latest thresholds. Now, the problem with this process is that, as you can see, I mean, you could see in some of the readings that you have, but as you can see from my own explanation here, is that there are all sorts of steps in the process, all sorts of steps where different kinds of assumptions need to be made, different calls and judgment need to be made in order to come up with an agreed threshold. And each step along the chain carries potential errors and potential problems when it comes to precision. First problem that we face when using these poverty lines is measurement validity. So again, I'm just going to throw a number of questions, and we think about it. Is calorie intake the best proxy for poverty? What about nutritional status? I.e., I can say that the minimum standard for nutrition, therefore, what is going to drive the poverty line is this 2,100 calories a day that every adult or adult equivalent needs to have. But you can reach these 2,100 calories in many different ways. I.e., we can eat very poorly and eat even more than that, or not. So think about, for example, in especially more affluent societies, the extent to which calorie intake is actually associated, excessive calorie intake is actually associated with poverty, i.e. in the US and Europe and so on. So again, there is an issue here, and there's an interesting discussion also in Alan's paper, how he comes up with the balance of cereals and sources of vitamin and so on and so forth. Is actually far more complicated than it seems. So the next question, how do we average across different diets in different countries? So the role of climate in these different diets. Do people need the same number of calories in these different contexts? And what happens to non-food poverty? Again, this is clear in Alan's paper, where you see that in certain countries, and you would expect much more weight for clothing or fuel than in other countries where this is not as important. So how can we have a global poverty line that it really encompasses all these differences? Second problem is item non-response, i.e. missing answers. Income, rent, remittances, many of these things are not sufficiently well measured in this household surveys, this national household surveys. So we do lose quite a bit of information there that may be quite important in order to really get relevant estimates of income. That's the first, the second thing. Then there's what we call unit non-response. In certain groups of the population may not participate in the surveys or may be missed out by design because of the way households, for example, are defined. And because of the logistics of surveys as well, which may not be able to reach all parts of the country. So when these mistakes, the item non-response or the unit non-response affect our data in a way that is non-random, i.e. that certain groups of people are more affected than others, then we can have quite substantial biases in our databases. Then there's a question of unreliable responses for items in our questionnaires. Food intake is actually really hard to estimate. When you go out and conduct these surveys, these consumption surveys, and try to estimate how much people consume of these different foods and so on, based on recall, then there is a potential for really large unobserved measurement errors. Very hard to actually know the extent to which these errors are random or more systematic for certain groups of people compared to others. And again, if we have a systematic measurement error, one of our core sources of evidence for our poverty estimates, then we be in real trouble. Then we have problems with the deflator, i.e. with the prices. Which prices are we using for these different items in our consumption basket? For food, are we using local market prices? Are we using provincial, regional averages? One thing we know from some of the research on poverty is that there is a poverty penalty when it comes to prices, i.e. because many poor people tend to consume much smaller amounts, or buy in the market much smaller amounts of food, then the unit price is actually much higher. So when it comes to using prices, if we use an average, we may be underestimating the extent to which the poorest are actually poor because of this error. So you can see here, there's just a number of examples of what things can get wrong, which lead me to say, well, there's a substantial element of false precision here. When we see data on poverty for countries or a global scale, we see these precise numbers. 54.3% of people are poor. Actually, how precise is this number is unclear, because the range may be 45 to 62, but we don't really know because a lot of these measurement errors are not properly taken into account into this picture. So, in a nutshell, this gold standard in the poverty measurement is inherently unreliable. And here I quote perhaps one of the economists who's worked most on questions of household service consumption and inequality. And he says that any estimate or level or of change is surrounded by a margin of error. pretty much what I've been talking about in the previous slide. This is often lost from sight in public pronouncements. Absolutely. And it is important to convey to policymakers and other users that they are operating with numbers about which there is considerable uncertainty. Obviously, when policymakers see a good story, i.e. poverty decline from X% to X%, they're going to repeat this claim endlessly because this is an important, useful, positive story. This statistical uncertainty will get lost in these pronouncements. So Atkinson really has a good, very, very important point to make here. And this is particularly important in the context of Sub-Saharan Africa, where poverty, the stakes of poverty data are so high. So many governments in the continent are so attached to these poverty figures that any small change, any small number can make quite a substantial difference when it comes to some of these public pronouncements or celebrations of the achievements of the country and the government in place. So here, let me show you two illustrations of this false position and why it's important to bear that in mind when we think about poverty nationally and globally. So this is for our global statistics of poverty. This is for the World Bank poverty, international poverty line. And here, this is an old table when the 2005 poverty statistics were published for the first time. And at that time, the key line was 1.25. And here I would like to highlight two contexts, China and Sub-Saharan Africa. And as you can see from this, when you look at the World Bank estimates then in 2005, the first thing that we say is that, well, the poverty reduction in China has been absolutely dramatic, from 84% to less than 16%. Okay, that's for that poverty line. Whereas in Sub-Saharan Africa, we basically see that there hasn't been any significant change. There was an increase up to the late 1990s, and then a slight, very, very modest reduction. And you could argue that, given everything that I've said, that this is within the margin of error. Therefore, we don't know whether poverty increase or decrease in Sub-Saharan Africa as a region over this period of time. But we would be far more confident when we talk about China. The problem I have with this is that, regardless of the trend may be consistent, especially for China. We do know that absolute living standards have substantially improved. But would we really believe that the poverty levels, the absolute poverty levels, were much higher in China in 1981 compared to the average regional Sub-Saharan Africa? That, I think, shows that there's something dodgy about this world poverty, international poverty line, in particularly the estimates for China, where pretty much the levels of poverty were similar to the 1820, the 19th century or the 18th century on a global scale in relation to Europe. Hard to believe, really, even if you think about the situation in China then, it would be really hard to believe. Does that affect the trend? Probably not. But is the trend exaggerated? Probably yes. Are the differences consistent between different regions? Probably not. So again, that is the first illustration. Second illustration is for one country. And I take the country where I used to work. And in fact, I was in that unit within the Ministry of Planning and Finance, which was always working on poverty profiles and poverty data. And here you see the comparisons and the trends across three different household surveys. 96-97 was the first one after the peace accords, so the third post-war national household survey, which was designed precisely to estimate the levels of poverty in the country. So it was pretty much driven by consumption budget questions in the questionnaire. And then we have the 2002-3, 2008-9 as comparison. So pretty much these surveys tend to be organized every 5 years, roughly. You can see here that, by and large, there has been a reduction in poverty. But interestingly, it's not a poverty reduction process that is sustained and clear-cut. In fact, what you see from the national figures is quite a substantial reduction in poverty in the first 5-year period between 97 and 2003, and pretty much no change in the next period. Well, this was particularly difficult to stomach for Mozambican policymakers because The situation in the second period, 2003, 2009, was not particularly different from the first period when it came, for example, to economic growth figures. The economy had been growing quite fast. In fact, generally all the standards had improved during that period, all the indicators had improved. So there was something uncertain, something unbelievable about these things. Now, if we zoom in to particular areas of the country, here I take Niassa, which was always known as probably the poorest province in Mozambique, and Sofala, which is one where you have different, deep pockets of poverty alongside areas of accumulation. You can see that the trends there do not seem to make a lot of sense. And in fact, when you look at Sofala, the first period, in only 5 years, apparently Sofala had seen a reduction of poverty from 88% to 36%. I would say that this is probably the most remarkable story of poverty reduction ever recorded in only 5 years. And when you think about what happened during that period of time, was there some kind of mega investment that changed the dynamics of the provincial economy? No. Actually, the biggest event that period were the 2000 floods, which actually had devastating impact on many areas of that province. So it's really hard to believe that poverty really declined to that extent. So what's interesting about this story in Mozambique is that created a lot of debates, internal debate within government, and also social debate, where people were basically questioning the validity of these poverty estimates. The government itself was not happy with the results of the 2008-9 survey, which basically showed that there had not been any reduction in poverty in the previous 5 years. And they held on the statistics for months, and they even sort of accused those working on the figures as unpatriotic, saying, well, that they made mistakes which were basically leading to an image which was against the interests of the country, and especially what the governor of Mozambique was thinking then, it was going against the interests of the government vis-a-vis the donors, which were looking very closely at these figures. So again, the stakes were very high in relation to these poverty figures, and therefore the uncertainty, what these numbers show, is a sheer level of uncertainty. Hard to really believe to what extent these are sufficiently precise or not. That's why I call this false precision. So what is the alternative to this? So we know that the dominant approach is this living standard measurement survey derived poverty line with purchasing power parity exchange rates, so the World Bank approach. But given these uncertainties, there have been other alternatives. Perhaps the most widely used is the multidimensional poverty index, where we look at a range of different indicators. So we forget about consumption expenditure as our monetary consumption expenditure as our leading indicator, and we look at all the other forms of deprivation, lack of access to sanitation, to education, health outcomes, etc. And we have a series of indicators which we put together. We come up with some thresholds for each of these indicators, and then we put that all together and we come up with a proportion of people who are multidimensionally poor. Again, this is an example of a mashup index where we put all sorts of indicators together, you average out, you include all sorts of arbitrary thresholds, and then you end up with another number, another proportion. Is this better than the World Bank approach? In some ways, yes, because it does look at a wider range of dimensions, so that is a good thing. But on the other hand, there's all sorts of judgments and decisions that are made statistically, which may also be driving another form of false position. Unlike the multidimensional poverty index, there are other sort of mashup indices, like, I don't know, the relative autonomy index, which tries to measure empowered decision making and so on. So there has been a whole industry of different forms of measuring, different ways of measuring poverty or deprivation that have led to disparate statistics and numbers for countries over time. Then you have asset indices. Asset indices are simpler in the sense that rather than trying to go for a very complicated consumption expenditure indicator, again, with plenty of measurement error there, we go to something that is easily observable, i.e. we look at assets, the conditions of the house, whether people have different items that can be easily observed and verified. And we compare within a given country different standards. We will have different standards for different assets, different sets of assets, and we will see the differences between poorer and more wealthier people within those societies. Obviously, the problem with these asset indices, of which the extreme deprivation index, which some of us have been working on, something that is really simple and easy to apply, and will allow us at least to identify the poorest of the poor. Okay, that is a big advantage. The disadvantage is that it's really difficult to move from this, to use these asset indices for a global poverty estimate. So this is something that's why the World Banks of this world would not like this kind of approach, because they would say, well, how can we know what's happened to global poverty by, if we rely on these asset indices? My answer to that would be, well, do we actually need to know? Or isn't it more interesting to actually identify who the poorest of the poor are in a given society, in a given country, rather than try to get these badly measured global poverty estimates? So again, this sort of process will go on forever, when it comes to measuring poverty. Now, measurement matters, however, because based on the different measurements that we have, we will be able to define who the poor are, how poverty is reduced. So the conventional poverty measurements that have been criticized in this session have led to a number of conventional poverty profiles. These poverty profiles, these are basically the characterizations of poverty in given countries that lead to policy prescriptions. So the poverty measurements matter in terms of driving the content of these poverty profiles, and also the content of the policy implications that are derived from these poverty profiles. So this is what I'm going to discuss now. What is what are the key elements of these poverty profiles? And that gives us a sense of the mainstream narrative of poverty reduction versus an alternative approach that is more based on basic lessons from history. And this is my third part of the session. Now, the most conventional, and this is a little bit of a caricature, but actually not far from what we really find in a lot of the poverty profiles, especially in the 1990s and 2000s. And these profiles basically show that a majority of people, and here I'm talking primarily of sub-Saharan African contexts, majority of people self-employed, very often regarded as subsistence farmers, isolated subsistence farmers. This, in a way, reflects this assumption of a homogeneous peasantry where all farmers, family farms are very similar, equally poor, etc., and contexts where labor markets are irrelevant, particularly in rural areas. Now, when you have that kind of profile, it's not surprising that the emphasis of the poverty reduction strategy will be on assets. If I'm self-employed, all I need is an asset. Give me land, give me credit, give me skills, okay? Give me machinery, give me capital, in short. So the idea in this narrative is that the poor can escape poverty through self-employment, okay, through their own efforts, so to speak, to use the more kind of ideological language. Land, more education, microcredit, so that with that credit you can acquire these assets, which will be important for your small businesses. So in a sense, this narrative would imply an image of a poverty reduction that is based on a mass of atomized micro entrepreneurs. So the more entrepreneurial you are, the better you will do with your self-employment, the more remuneration you will get, the more likely you are to escape poverty. The conventional poverty profiles also tended to show that large households were poorer. So given conventional definitions of the households, and there's lots of problems with how households have been defined, particularly in African contexts, population control would be an implication of this. So if you add to the emphasis on assets, some population control, then there you go. You will have poverty reduction. What these poverty profiles tend to reflect is primarily a sort of static snapshot of the situation, which, not surprisingly, leads to a focus on the short term. So if the snapshot that you've taken is one where, oh, look, most people are self-employed, therefore what we need is to improve their self-employment status, okay, to improve the sort of marginally, in the margin, to improve what they make through their own businesses, through their own livelihoods, self-employed livelihoods, okay? Then what you get is this kind of short-term, really short-term poverty reduction strategies, which is pretty much the kinds of strategies that dominated in those early years of the so-called poverty reduction strategies in the 2000s onwards. And this was particularly important in the sub-Saharan African context, not only in Africa, also in parts of Asia and Latin America, but primarily in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, the alternative to these, forget about the consumption expenditure surveys, let's see who the poorest of the poor are. And when we conduct micro-level research, where we've done that in different African contexts, and this also has been done in non-African contexts, you get to three sets of characteristics that tend to be associated with the most highest levels of deprivation and with the poorest of the poor. So you have demographic characteristics like the high adult female-male ratios or the lack of male presence, the presence of teenage mothers, and the high child dependency ratios, very often associated with very extreme levels of deprivation on other dimensions, other indicators. Then we have severe education deprivation, especially female education, and you will see, again, these are all relatively easily observable. It's harder to make mistakes in terms of measurement errors, and therefore far more precise in a way than our consumption expenditure estimates. Very high infant mortality is by and large across different kinds of contexts a key marker of extreme deprivation and poverty. Inferior housing conditions given the standards in each society, whether it's rural or urban settings, and the possession of basic items and assets, which in some cases could include cattle, being well below the average. So this is a mix of what I called before asset indices, but also all the types of indicators. And this approach would be multidimensional in nature, but would not be the same as the multidimensional poverty indicator that I mentioned at the beginning when thinking about alternatives. Now, when we do this research, we use these kinds of indicators and we identify who the poorest of the poor are. We also find other pieces of interest and evidence. So what we find is that most of the time, these poorest rural households contain individuals who work as manual agricultural wage workers, and particularly in the case of women who don't have male presence in the household. These poorest households also rely on these wages to survive. i.e. they may be doing other things, they may have a small plot, small farm, etc., but by and large, their survival is determined by how many days of work they manage to command every year, and by the level of wages, real wages, they get from these casual jobs. Interestingly, this is not particularly unique to different African contexts. This is exactly the same that you find in many parts of Asia, particularly India, where these kinds of numbers, indicators, and data are actually collected in a more disaggregated fashion. Now, what we know from history, and when you look at the overall patterns, is actually self-employment is negatively associated with GDP per capita. So what you expect is that as countries improve the level of GDP per capita, the proportion of self-employment dramatically drops. And this is primarily because this is the process that characterizes capitalist developments on a national and global scale, where there's a mass increase in the proportion of people who are dependent on different kinds of wages. And again, when we think about wage employment, salary employment, this is not about the standard employment relationship. There are different ways for people to depend on wages and different levels of insecurity and uncertainty that are associated with different types of wage jobs. So we're not talking about a labor aristocracy here. Whether we look at rich countries or poor countries, the wage employed are a very heterogeneous set. However, the World Bank statistics tend to emphasize very often that particularly Sub-Saharan Africa are quite different from the rest, where you see self-employment being a substantial proportion of the population. But this is partly driven by the way wage employment remains uncaptured or very badly captured in these household surveys that I've been talking about. So, for example, when we were conducting research in rural areas of Ethiopia and Uganda, and we've done the same previously in Mozambique, by and large, we always found the same picture, that a far higher proportion of adults actually participated in local labor markets, actually depended to some extent on wage labor, whether it was wage labor in agriculture or wage labor in non-agricultural activities that varied across sites. Also, what we find is that this varies a lot across different parts of each country. You have pockets where you have quite substantial widespread wage employment in agriculture and other areas where this doesn't happen to the same extent. What we also observe in this context is that by and large, people who were more dependent on these wage jobs were also far poorer than the others, whether we looked at comparisons within the same surveys or whether we looked at comparisons with other nationally representative surveys like the ERSS in Ethiopia, the DHS there. So by and large, we get this image that once we identify the poorest of the poor in this particular context, they tended to be much more dependent on wages to survive, and also they were far poorer than the others. Is this unique? No, of course not. When we look at other stories of poverty reduction, so if we think about India's story about rural poverty reduction, we see that what happened to real wages for the casual agricultural workers is absolutely crucial. So one thing that these authors say, for example, is the expansion of the non-farm sector appears to put pressure on wage rates in agriculture. And rising agricultural wage rates are in turn shown to be strongly correlated with rural poverty reduction. Again, this dynamic of relationship between rural poverty reduction and what happened to the poorest of the poor who are more dependent on wages is crucial to understanding these different processes. They also emphasize the importance of public policies in the 1980s, not simply because these different state interventions in India led to these different kinds of support to the poor, but basically because of the impact these policies, these interventions had on local labor markets. To the extent that they tightened local labor markets, that led to increasing in real wages, particularly for the poorest casual agricultural wage workers. And again, that was substantially linked to this process of poverty reduction in rural areas of India. So that's one example that is worth noting. What about China? Well, China's story of poverty reduction is quite interesting. In a sense, it's not too different from what we've seen, the context of sustained capitalist development in the global north. But it's the speed and the kinds of particular dynamics that happen in China that are important to note. First, the rapid structural change and industrialization happen in different phases. Most of the time we pay attention to the post-reform period, the 1978 onwards, but actually a lot of that structural change had already happened in the Maoist period, and that created the seeds for the sort of dynamics that we observed in the 1980s, 1990s. And that includes the role of rural industrialization, and particularly the role of the town and village enterprises, which absorbed a large labor surplus from agriculture within areas. So in a sense, it's not a simple story of people moving to the coastal areas of China for export, which is the third point here. The role of manufacturing exports in creating these jobs, but also the role of rural industrialization in absorbing this labor surplus. And of course, the gradual development of capitalist relations in agriculture. Capitalist relations from a system of collectivized agriculture, which had been strongly capitalized. I mean, a lot of investment in infrastructure had been achieved by the end of the 1970s, early 1980s. And the gradual development of capitalist relations in agriculture in China, also took advantage of that capital stock that already existed before, and therefore farmers, small-scale farmers and others, managed to substantially improve their conditions. And what's interesting is the governance of this process of social change in China. What Yuan Ang directed improvisation. To what extent all this happened, not simply because of central direction from the Communist Party of China, but the amount of substantial delegation that happens on local provincial governments that gave space for innovation, for improvisation, for adaptation of these different types of intervention. So you see that in different parts of China, these processes that I try to capture with these basic bullet points vary quite a lot. So the dynamics in coastal China, in sort of the Guangzhou, etc., was quite different from the dynamics in parts of central China or northern China and so on. So that's also interesting in terms of the kinds of lessons, the sort of territorial mix of different types of drivers of poverty reduction that you have in a very, very large country like China. But by and large, the big lesson from these examples is what happens to labor, what happens to these labor markets and the labor dynamics as linked to structural change and how these affects poverty dynamics. So in a nutshell, what this means is that we can't understand poverty dynamics of the long run, especially without an understanding of these broader labor dynamics that have happened in the past. Allen, when he looks at historical processes, looks at, for example, the situation in England, in other parts of Western Europe, he always said this: the real wage of unskilled workers really provides some indication of the severity of poverty in the past. So it was by looking at those who were dependent on these wages, which were already present in the 17th, 18th century in England, that you look at what happened to poverty. So again, it's another example of looking at labor dynamics in the form of looking at real wages and poverty as a proxy for poverty dynamics. So if we're interested in poverty in a country like Ethiopia, for example, then we would be paying much more attention to these daily wages, for example. And you would see, in fact, that despite the conventional official poverty figures in Ethiopia, actually what has happened to the real wages that affect particularly the casual labor has been relatively uncertain. There have been periods of improvements followed by periods of deterioration and so on and so forth. There isn't a very, very clear-cut trend during this period of time where the official poverty figures suggested quite a substantial decline in estimated poverty. So the same happens when we look at the changes in terms of industrial jobs and the difference between rising East Asia and the importance of industrial employment there and the vast majority of low-income countries, which include many of sub-Saharan African countries. And all this may happen at the same time as, many people tend to pay attention to this question of informality. So of course, a lot of these jobs, whether self-employment or wage employment, but particularly wage employment, may be informal jobs in terms of how informality is usually defined. And that is not necessarily surprising. In fact, if we were to use these kinds of characterizations, these kinds of definitions, the vast majority of jobs in 19th century England were actually informal as the jobs that we see today in many parts of the most dynamic growing East Asian, Southeast Asian countries. So of course, a lot of these informal work is hugely challenging, is hugely heavy, but this is by and large the substantial majority of the jobs that we tend to find, especially in the rural areas that you visit. But the big question really is, when we observe these different types of livelihoods, is, are the wage employed, self-employed, are the lines blurred? And we found that this was particularly clear in a lot of the activities that we find in so-called urban informal sector, particularly in transport. Indeed, most of the jobs that we find in these informal transport activities tend to be wage jobs rather than micro enterprises. When you use the definitions more accurately and more precisely, then you clearly see that the vast majority of the people working in these so-called businesses tend to be wage employed, and some of them actually casually wage employed. It really depends on the vagaries of the market for these services and what the bosses, the owners of these vehicles, actually are prepared to pay them. But the characteristics of the people working in these different jobs vary a lot in relation to the degree of income, the level of income and degree of power that they have. So this is a characterization that my colleague Jens Lache did for occupational hierarchies in India, where you can see And when you look at wage labor and self-employment, quite substantial differences when you compare, both ends of the spectrum. The wage labor with formal contract in formal economy compared to the sort of casual, unprotected wage labor in agriculture, which was associated, as I said before, to the poorest of the poor in that context. So, in order to understand poverty dynamics in this context, we should be paying more attention to these particular types of jobs, like formal sector workers, home workers, casual unprotected wage workers in agriculture, bonded labor, and then you have the survival self-employed people. And again, the needs of these different groups of people will be different according to the specific nature of their activities. And therefore, the kinds of strategies, interventions that will affect the livelihoods will also be different. So the reason I say this is that very often the dominant poverty reduction strategies have tended to be extremely superficial, all-encompassing, not really looking at the particularities of these different groups of people who are affected by different issues. So what are the policy implications of all these? Well, first, many of these standard policy interventions have been very dominant in much of the narrative of poverty. Mainstream narrative of poverty reduction is that microcredits, input supplies, extension services for smallholders are likely to benefit the poor only indirectly, if at all. Neoliberal ideology means that almost all rural interventions tend to be focused on the producers, on the self-employed and entrepreneurs rather than workers. So those strategies are unlikely to really have a real impact on the poorest of the poor, unless we believe in a sort of more trivial trickle-down mechanism. So, for example, is the support to smallholder coffee farmers in Ethiopia through fair trade, let's say, i.e. a form of improvement in access to markets, is that going to really benefit the poorest rural people, i.e. the casual wage workers who pick the coffee of these smallholder farmers? But again, this is an empirical question. And the answer we've had in our own research is that these trickle-down mechanisms are actually quite weak unless you have other types of interventions. But perhaps the biggest problem with a lot of the dominant mainstream poverty reduction narrative is the extent to which, as Ha-Joon Chang, and I think Ha-Joon has already given a session in this course, the extent to which development nowadays in this mainstream narrative has come to mean poverty reduction, provision of basic needs, individual betterment, the maintenance of existing productive structures. So anything but development in this traditional sense, i.e. all the structural change has been stripped off this broad definition of what development is in relation to poverty reduction. Ha-Joon also says that doing more of the same thing in terms of one's productive activities is not how today's developed countries have become developed. That mainstream development discourse he follows sees these increases in productive capabilities of the individuals as happening mainly through individual betterment. So this requires quite a substantial revision of our approach to poverty. We really want to incorporate the lessons from history and our understanding of poverty reduction as connected to labor dynamics and structural change. We would be substantially departing from this conventional narrative. And this is precisely the point that Alice Amsden, another famous heterodox development economist, made when she intervened in this debate about poverty reduction strategies. She argued that what she called the grassroots supply-side approach to poverty reduction, this was basically the mainstream approach, which was followed not just by the international financial institutions, but also by so many NGOs. She said that a supply of better clothed, housed, and fed workers automatically creates the demand to employ it at a living wage. That was a very, very big fallacy, which reflected what she called job dimension, that jobs, labor markets had basically disappeared from this mainstream discourse. She argued that the returns to self-employed in informal services are often lower than returns to agricultural wage work, that poverty reduction historically tends to involve that most of the lower skilled workers have a secure wage earning job. And she really questioned the extent to which some of the interventions to reduce poverty, such as cash transfers, could be really seen as transformative or just a form of social protection. So the alternative view from Amsterdam is that what you actually see historically is that an increase in large and medium-scale factory employment, or a focus on poverty alleviation of professionally managed small and medium-sized firms, more professional, more likely to survive than the typical micro-enterprise of the self-employed, might provide a way for the poorest countries to break into this circle. Again, remember the China story that I mentioned before. So, is there a contradiction between development and poverty reduction? Therefore, not really. When you look at it from this point of view, poverty reduction, and indeed you could go further and say poverty eradication in the long term, is an integral part of the process of economic and social development, both as a consequence and as a cause. However, it doesn't happen as a simple one-to-one causal link between economic growth and poverty reduction. This is what the late Thandikam Kandawire also called the trivialized trickle-down economics in much of the poverty reduction agenda, i.e. not really going into when we say economic growth, what do we mean by that? What is the nature of economic growth that really leads to significant poverty reduction? It is the pattern of economic growth that matters, and how can we characterize it? So by oversimplifying the relationship between poverty and growth, both poverty and growth have been trivialized, as Kandawire used to argue. And that has been pretty much the problem in much of the literature, the mainstream discourse, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. So one thing is eradicating poverty with the long-run view, and another one is dealing with poverty in the short term. As you probably know, a lot of the interventions are very often put forward by the NGO movements and by the international organizations tend to focus on the social safety nets. And some have argued, people like Thandika, but also Andrew Fisher, that many of the social safety nets are primarily a sort of neoliberal answer to structural poverty, but they don't really address the structural causes of poverty, which lie at the heart of the lack of structural change. So what are the basic lessons from history then? So first thing is, as we know, as gross national income per capita increases, agricultural workers are absorbed into non-agricultural wage and salary employment, and the proportion of non-agricultural wage and salary workers increases from X% to very, very high percentage in high-income countries. The other process that we observe in the very long term, and a higher and higher percentage of these workers are employed in larger scale enterprises rather than the micro enterprises. In some cases, you have, depending on the structure of the economy, you have medium-sized enterprises. But even the issue of scale is also quite context specific. So it really depends on the sectors. It really depends on the particular types of activities that grow and emerge in different contexts. So the key indicator of economic development actually is a sustained labor productivity growth, particularly when we look at rural areas. So the more structural change, the faster the labor productivity growth that we're going to see in rural areas. And that has happened indeed in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, but it has happened far faster, far quicker in East Asia, which is a sort of more recent example of sustained structural change with growth. So therefore, specifically, what kinds of interventions? If we are now in a country where we pay more attention to labor issues, we pay more attention to the relationship between the condition of labor and poverty, what kinds of specific interventions would we think as potentially effective in reducing poverty? So there is indeed a role for direct intervention in labor markets, improving the conditions of those who are employed, having independent trade unions, having a system of labor inspectors that is more organized, that is basically where labor legislation is better enforced, maternity leave, minimum wages, policing child labor, etc., etc. It would be hard to disagree that these are worthwhile interventions. They're likely to have a positive impact on the condition of labor of some of the poorest people. But they're extremely difficult to monitor, particularly in poorer countries. So the extent to which we can rely on these kinds of interventions is only limited. it will increase as structural change happens and as the economies evolve, but it does take time. So another venue, a potential venue for improving labor market conditions, is doing anything that can tighten these labor markets, that can increase the bargaining power of those who work for wages by reducing the overall supply into this market. So education, especially for rural girls, ensuring that girls stay in school through a variety of forms of support, biased educational expenditure cash transfer direct to girls to go to secondary schools. That is something that has been shown to have an impact on the tightening of labor markets in different parts of the world, and particularly in Asia. Or more targeted infrastructure interventions, transport, communication, roads, irrigation, storage, etc., that favors the development of agricultural activities that are more likely to generate jobs for the poorest people in these areas, or rural industries for the matter. So if we focus on agricultural activities that are more likely to create jobs where labor demand per hectare is greater, then obviously that would be a clear potential target for policymakers. So here's an illustration from Northeast Brazil, where you can see that the labor demand per hectare is very different when you compare sort of horticultural exports like grapes, banana, guava, etc. And this is within the same region, to livestock or annual irrigated crops, which creates fewer number of working days per hectare. And this is a very important indicator actually for the poorest of the poor, this working days per hectare when you're working in agriculture. Really, this is going to determine a significant amount of your annual income for those who depend on wages in these activities. And then there's the overall state expenditure that is designed to improve the quality and quantity of output in those activities that are more likely to generate jobs for the poorest of the poor. So this is a mix of, for example, helping transform agricultural sector by improving the productivity of the sector and labor demand within the sector, at the same time as interventions are designed to accelerate a structural change by investing in the infrastructure and support for emerging manufacturing, for example, what happened in Ethiopia in recent years with all the industrial parks that generated thousands of jobs. But it's not just, the sort of traditional manufacturing sector that ought to be the target, is what some economists have called the industries without smokestacks, i.e. activities, other types of activities that do generate new jobs with higher productivity, higher remuneration within agriculture and in services as well. So it requires a broader understanding of this process of structural change. But generally, the bottom line is that focusing on those sectors with the greatest potential to contribute to both the balance of payments objectives and to the employment poverty reduction objectives that should be supported. And when we talk about support, again, these are state interventions, and I'm sure that you've heard of these before in other sessions of the course. It's critical that the support is conditional, that there are reciprocal control mechanisms that allow governments to actually discipline those who receive the support, so that basic conditions are monitored to see whether wages are decent, jobs are created, exports are generated, export quality productivity is achieved, etc. The kinds of things that happen in some Asian contexts, about which Alice Amsden also often talked about. But let me end with a set of final reflections, and then we will move to questions from the audience. I think the first key message is to beware of false positioning the standard poverty indicators and try to combine different types of evidence and indicators to make sense of what's happening to poverty, particularly in a given country. I think it's far more difficult to really make sense of poverty on a global scale than it is referring to specific countries. Secondly, policies matter, state intervention matters, and policies really are required to promote employment growth. And that means that this is not just about industrial policy designed to generate the kind of structural change that will be associated with this employment growth, but it's also macro policies. And I think in the course you have also discussed this in other sessions. The kinds of fiscal and monetary policies are more likely to contribute to this more virtuous circle of employment growth and poverty reduction through structural change. The third point, I think, is the importance of understanding the context specificity of policy choices. We do have lots of lessons from history. I gave the example of India, China, high income countries, global north, but we always need to take these examples with a pinch of salt. What kinds of policy mixes are more likely to be successful in specific contexts will depend on that context itself. The fourth point is really the importance of focusing on production. So having more creative, more interventionist sector policies that boost the prospects for structural change towards production that is going to generate the kind of employment that we want for poverty reduction. Fifth is the role of demand, as I mentioned in the previous slides. Always important for policymakers to pay a lot of attention to the different labor demands from different types of activities, different kinds of sectors, and different policy options. And finally, I think it's worth keeping this distinction clear between the poverty reduction that happens over the long term through a process of dynamic economic development, growth with structural change, etc., from what we understand as social protection, i.e., in any given context, the kinds of interventions that are needed to protect the poorest of the poor, to make sure that the most vulnerable are not penalized by, for example, the growing inequalities and so on that may happen as part of the process of growth. So cash transfers, interventions like cash transfers may indeed have a role to play in the process, but not the kind of role that has been assigned to it by the mainstream development discourse. It's a complementary role to the other kinds of interventions that are designed to generate these dynamic linkages between economic development growth and poverty reduction. And let me finish there and take a little bit of a stretching break before we move on to questions.